Welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is David Gray. I direct the Workforce and Family Program here, and on behalf of our program and the Foundation and our next social contract initiative, I'd like to welcome you to this event. We're going to focus here today a bit on inequality and the American Dream by highlighting our new book, The Missing Class: Portraits of the Near Poor in America, by Katherine Newman and Victor Tan Chen. There's an increase, as you all know, that has drawn you here, no doubt, in the issue of inequality in America and the poor. And yet many people have concerns about the needs and experiences of what our two guests have termed the missing class, those individuals, those families of four making between $20,000 and $40,000 a year. Many feel that their needs are being largely ignored, and we here at New America are quite interested and concerned about the fraying social contract, so much so that we've launched an initiative to look at what we can do as a nation to try and strengthen it. Concerns about the experiences, lives, and needs of families in the missing poor is what led Katherine Newman and Victor Tan Chen to spend, if my math is correct, really 7 years looking at 9 families or so in New York and examining their lives and their experiences and the key learnings that they took away from those interviews and analysis of their experiences, their struggles, how they deal with the fraying social contract, everything from economic mobility and education to home ownership, family formation, and health care. I spent the weekend reading this book, very exciting. I agree with the introduction that you are compelled to root for the families and individuals which they've chronicled here. I think they're important lessons for us as we think about the American dream and how to strengthen our social contract. So I find this book, which is available here actually outside when you leave for sale, as a very compelling piece, and we're just thrilled that Katherine and Victor took time out of their busy schedule to be with us today. Katherine S. Newman is the Malcolm S. Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at Princeton University. She's the author of 8 other books in addition to The Missing Class on poverty, downward mobility, and school violence, and has previously taught at Harvard, Columbia, and the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome, Kathy. And Victor is a Harvard doctoral candidate in sociology and social policy, the founding editor of inequality.org, an award-winning magazine that seeks to question, inform, and inspire conversations about identity and community. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to welcome first Kathy and then Victor here to talk a little bit about their experience in putting together this extraordinary book and about what they've learned, and then we'll go with your questions. So, Kathy?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the New America Foundation for hosting this dialogue. Victor and I are very grateful for your attention and interest in this topic. I'd like to start by talking about who are the missing class. Who are these people that we're trying to draw attention to? Because they're not the usual suspects. They're not the people that either I've written about or that any other authors I can think of have focused on. They are the more than 50 million Americans, almost 1 in 6 people in our country, who fall into the category of the near poor. As our introduction mentioned, the near poor are those American families who today earn between $20,000 and $40,000 a year for a family of 4. So they are not the poor, and they shouldn't be confused with the working poor or any other kind of poor, because they are not below the poverty line. They are above the poverty line. In fact, at $40,000, they go up to twice the poverty line. They work as transit workers, as daycare providers, as teachers' aides, as hospital attendants, clerical assistants, security guards. Essentially, they're in the sort of low to middle range of the service sector in our country. They tend not to be blue-collar workers, for example, though they might have been in an earlier generation. You might call them working class, but they work increasingly in white-collar workplaces and often don't have union protection, though the best off of them do. The missing class includes 21% of the nation's children. That makes it a very large group of people indeed, and it is therefore striking to us that so little attention has been focused on this group, apart from the much-needed debate over the S-chip bill, where these families do surface, though they're not called near poor and they're not termed the missing class. So how are they different from the poor? This will help us understand why we needed a book on this topic. First, the missing class is much larger than the nation's poor. There are about 37 million Americans who are below the poverty line, and as I said, over 50 million in the missing class. This doesn't mean they're somehow more deserving of our attention. Those below the poverty line are indeed very important and much more destitute. Nonetheless, at over 50 million and 21% of the nation's children, this vulnerable group we call the missing class, I think, is deserving of public attention. Because they earn more than those below the poverty line, the missing class do not generally receive public assistance, such as welfare, food stamps, or Medicaid, all of which are undoubtedly properly dedicated to the support of the poor. But unlike the middle class, they're largely ignored by most politicians and by most policies. We don't tend to direct our policies toward them, and their earnings tend to escape the boundaries of most of our transfer programs. They are better off than the poor. They face a very different set of problems because they're better off. First, in order to be better off, they work very, very long hours, and often at multiple jobs. In fact, it's almost impossible to be in the missing class without multiple jobs in a household. But they have very modest wages and relatively few savings. They tend not to be homeowners, for example, which is a very important, obviously, a very important asset for the 68% of the American population that lives in home-owned houses. We won't find very many people in the missing class in that group. So they are very much betwixt and between. They are in between that group politicians pay attention to, who vote heavily, the middle class, and the truly poor, for whom our benefit programs are structured such as they are. But because they work every hour around the clock, missing class parents are often missing in other ways. That is, they have relatively little time with their children who do need them, and need them ever more increasingly, as I'll argue in a moment, because of the pressures that they're under at both young and at teenage years to perform well in school, and missing class children often find themselves in trouble in school without the kind of support that parents might be able to give if they were around more or if they had more skills. So their children tend to go without quality daycare, and in this book we chronicle the lives of young children who find themselves in extremely substandard, scary daycare with people with drug problems around them, therefore entering school poorly prepared in ways that will damage them over the long run in terms of their schooling prospects. They are also not likely to find themselves eligible for or able to enjoy the kind of after-school programs that, say, my children could look forward to when they entered their high school years, because these kids are not in schools where there are rich and enjoyable after-school programs. And that leads to problems for teenage kids in the missing class who run off the rails without parental supervision and in some cases end up in the criminal justice system. Nonetheless, and despite the fact that we're going to emphasize some of the problems that they face, I do want to point out that the missing class is considerably better off than the poor. They tend to live in areas, as Victor will detail in a moment, that are not as crushingly poor, that are more racially integrated than the truly poor. They do have more earnings, and that matters. And in fact, the adults in missing class families, especially those for whom missing class status is actually upward mobility, up from poverty, do feel themselves to be accomplished, to have made good on certain promises they made to themselves and to their families in life. And so they do not conceive of themselves as some sort of disaster terrain, even though they are quite vulnerable to the potential of falling below the poverty line. Relative to where many of them came from, they actually represent success stories, but not confirmed, secure success stories. They are one disaster away, one layoff, one divorce, one illness from poverty. And in the late 1990s, about 16% of them lost significant income. So even in the boom years, the near poor can falter and fall below the poverty line year to year. Well, why should we care about these people? They're not the destitute, so isn't that really who we should worry about? In this book, Victor and I argue that we should care about the near poor, and for several reasons. First, they really do represent the promise of the country in terms of what welfare reform was supposed to accomplish, what we were supposed to see in terms of the rewards that come to those who work hard. And if they can make it, if they can move up above the poverty line and stay there and see the next generation follow them, then that promise will have been realized. The floor will be cleared for those who come behind them. If, on the other hand, they go the other direction and find themselves vulnerable to falling below the poverty line, then we will see a repetition both in their adult lives and even more striking perhaps in the next generation coming behind them of the problems that we have been trying to eradicate, welfare dependency, crime, and so on. And so we need to pay attention to the near poor because of their size, because of their vulnerability, and because if what we were trying to do was crack the poverty problem in an intergenerational sense, the vulnerabilities of their children in terms of education in particular may well see the next generation repeating the pathway into poverty rather than following their parents into upward mobility. Let me tell you a little bit about some of the families we profile in this book, because unlike other books that I've written where I try and dwell on the social issues and embed the families, here we really try and tell this story through the narrative of these families' lives. And their lives help us learn something about the kinds of burdens that they face. Let me begin, for example, with Tomas Linares, who is of Puerto Rican origin, came to the U.S. when he was in his mid-teens, had a sort of wild life as a young man living in a fairly dicey neighborhood, Puerto Rican neighborhood of Sunset Park. Had 2 kids when he was married, divorced, but nonetheless continued to support those 2 kids. He works today at 2 jobs, 7 days a week. He works 5 days a week for a facility that takes care of the mentally retarded adults, and he basically takes care of them all day. And he works the other 2 days a week on the weekends working in a hospital context. So he works 7 days a week, and with that, those long work hours, barely clears $20,000 a year, which means he lives in a shabby, cockroach-infested apartment in Sunset Park, in a neighborhood that is nonetheless gentrifying. So while he's been able to hold on to his place in this neighborhood, as the neighborhood has actually improved around him, his own living circumstances are fairly meager. And lots of people depend on Tomas Linares, and this is quite common in missing class families. That is, they often represent the most upwardly mobile people in their social circle. So a lot of people are looking for their help because they actually have slightly more in the way of income than other members of their families. So Tomas's girlfriend expects him to help with her mortgage payments. His 2 daughters, one of whom has children of her own, want him to be helpful. His elderly mother expects to see him every day and sometimes needs his support. So Tomas, meager as his income is actually stretched in many directions by the mere fact that he is among the more capable and prosperous people in his family. Let me speak for a moment about Danielle Wayne, who was formerly a welfare recipient, who actually started off her career in the labor market because of welfare reform. She is one of those people who might not have gone out into the labor force had she not been pushed, but she was pushed, and it turned out to be a very good thing indeed for her. When I first met her, 7 years before this book was written, she was a clinically depressed mother of 3 children who had suffered from an abusive relationship with her husband, did everything she could to care for her children, but was clearly struggling in terms of her own mental health. But once she found her job, in fact, she now works for the Human Services Department in New York City in the city's welfare system, her depression began to lift, because going to work and being part of the able-bodied workforce is a tremendously important source of honor and dignity in American culture. And Danielle began to revive her spirits simply by being out in the workforce. So if we were to ask whether or not Danielle Wayne herself is better off today than she was before she was in the labor force, there would be no question that she is herself more stable, happier, more optimistic about her own future. However, if we look at the next generation coming up behind her, we may have more question marks. Danielle's children were very well taken care of when she was at home. She hovered over their education. She was a very active member of the PTA, even in the middle of her depression. She volunteered at school. She helped them with their homework. She was able to maneuver in the school to make sure her children got the best teachers available in what was not a very good school. But now that she's working as many hours as she is, she's had to press her older children into her family labor force, so to speak, helping to take care of her youngest. So her 9-year-old daughter is responsible for a lot of after-school care, so to speak, for the baby in the family, the 2-year-old. While Danielle is at work and her older sister is in school, The baby is being taken care of by Danielle's ex-mother-in-law in a housing project with drug addicts not only nearby but actually floating in and out of the home. The little girl does not have a very nurturing environment, and in the time that I spent with her, really had only 2 words: shut up. That was it. At the age of 3, that was more or less all that the little one could communicate. And in the child care setting in which she's living, or which she's spending most of her daytime hours, it's not at all clear to me that she was going to learn her colors or numbers or anything else that was going to help her prepare for kindergarten. And we have to understand that under these circumstances, kids like this little girl are going to end up in 3rd grade being tested by the No Child Left Behind high-stakes tests, and if they don't pass them, they will be the kids held back. And in those neighborhoods, in the neighborhood where Danielle lives, a very disproportionate set of kids are being held back in school. They are failing those tests, and they are our future high school dropouts. So the fact that Danielle herself is doing better, by all counts doing better, does not ensure that her children are going to follow in her footsteps. In fact, it may be quite the opposite. Let me speak just for a minute about the healthcare situation, and then I'm going to turn it over to Victor to talk about some other issues that plague the missing class. Healthcare, we know, is a very important debate now, and it's one in which these kinds of families really do figure importantly because they earn too much to be on Medicaid, but they don't work for the kinds of employers like mine who provide high-quality health insurance. And they are plagued with health care problems that go way too far before they're caught by medical professionals, and as a result are much more serious and no doubt more expensive to treat. So let me speak for a moment about the Guerrera family. Tamar Guerrera, who works in a factory about an hour and a half away from her home, who's no longer around to supervise her children, has a young son who developed severe lead poisoning because the landlord where they live failed to clean up the lead in their rundown apartment. This is not uncommon in neighborhoods where missing class families live. These are old pre-war apartments. They were built with lead paint, and these are the children who are today suffering from lead poisoning, which leads to developmental delays and brain damage. And that's exactly what has happened to Manuel, who at the age of 4 was not toilet trained. And that has something to do with the sort of problems that he faces as a consequence of brain damage. Or Gloria Hall, who actually had a well-paying job in law enforcement, which was unionized, until she became ill with cancer. Gloria represents a different kind of circumstance in the health debate, not the uninsured. She had health insurance, or has health insurance, but weak or bad health insurance that pays for catastrophic care, but not the kind of preventative care that really would help catch a problem in its early stages. So her HMO did not want to pay for tests that might have caught her fairly deadly cancer earlier. And they didn't want to pay for top-end cancer treatment once she was diagnosed. This pushed her down into the Medicaid system. She basically had to strip her assets so that she could end up going to the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, which has the most advanced treatment. So the health problems have to do with chronic exposure to toxins that lead to problems, health problems in young children, to problems like ADHD, which are quite common in missing class neighborhoods, to the problems that adults face that are not treated until they become really quite catastrophic. So the healthcare problems are quite serious for these families. Let me then take a quick break and ask Victor to talk about some of the other issues we think matter.
Thanks, Kathy, and my thanks to David Gray and the New America Foundation for inviting us. I'll be talking about the neighborhoods that near poor families live in and the challenges they face saving money and building assets. In urban America, the neighborhoods that near poor families live in tend to be neighborhoods undergoing 2 trends: gentrification and the arrival of new immigrants. These trends present some advantages and some disadvantages for the near poor. In New York, for a study, we looked at the neighborhoods of Clinton Hill, Fort Greene, and Sunset Park in Brooklyn, and Washington Heights in Manhattan. And these are neighborhoods that have experienced dramatic changes over the past few decades. Like many other urban areas in America, they saw rising rates of drug use and crime in the 1970s and 1980s, and a period of rapid decline. The middle class fled these neighborhoods during this time. But in the boom years of the late 1990s, jobs and real estate investment came back to the cities, and especially to near-poor neighborhoods, which were not far from affluent areas, even though they abutted poor enclaves as well. We also saw a situation of improved policing, which helped to reduce crime in these neighborhoods. So the two trends that we're looking at, the first is integration by gentrification. And in this trend, we see overheated real estate markets in wealthier parts of the cities create spillover into near-poor neighborhoods. You have young urban professionals moving into these neighborhoods, seeking lower rents. And this leads to integration, both socioeconomic and racial. But it is a uncertain kind of integration because near-poor families who have long lived in these neighborhoods are in danger of being priced out by rising rents and the rising cost of living. And we see this trend in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Clinton Hill, that is, and also the northern Manhattan neighborhood of Washington Heights. Once centers of drug dealing and crime, these neighborhoods started gentrifying in the late 1990s and the early part of this decade thanks to falling crime, relatively low rents compared to the upscale neighborhoods, and the overall climate of investment. Many near-poor residents in these neighborhoods, however, either could not afford the rising rents, or they sold their, if they were homeowners, they sold their houses to developers, building luxury apartments in these gentrifying neighborhoods. So the situation for the near poor is basically one of relative deprivation. The near poor are doing better than they were previously, but they're doing worse in comparison to the newcomers in their neighborhoods. On one hand, gentrification clearly has a positive side in that renovation of housing improves the quality of life. The arrival of wealthier newcomers also gives the near poor collateral benefits because politicians and police pay greater attention to the neighborhood, which leads to reduced crime, better schools, and greater investment in infrastructure such as transportation services. On the other hand, gentrification leads to rising costs of living that hurt many near-poor families. Stores no longer cater to the needs of near-poor households, and it may be harder for them to find affordable food, clothing, and other essentials. Gentrification may also lead to resentment and psychological distress among old-timers who no longer feel that this is their neighborhood. This is a situation we see in Clinton Hill, where one of the families we studied, the Floyd family, lives. And they feel increasingly out of place in their previously black and working-class neighborhood. Their neighborhood pharmacy closed, which filled their prescriptions at a discount. Their favorite social club, where they used to meet their friends and play pool and cards, closed down as well. And they see in their place chic bars and restaurants catering to young people. And they're upset by this. They're upset by the arrival of hipsters with purple hair and yuppies with fancy sports cars in their neighborhood. It just doesn't feel like a home anymore to them. The problem that many of these Newport neighborhoods face is that they're stuck between two places. They're in a period of transition between the upward mobility provided by gentrification and the poverty of the neighborhood's past. They're also geographically stuck between richer and poorer areas, close enough for yuppies to move in, but also close enough, too, for the problems of poor neighborhoods to spill over. Royce and Rashia, two of the grandchildren of John and Sandra Floyd, show some of these various influences at work. Rashia is a stellar student who is benefiting from the improved education in the neighborhood schools and the improved environment on the streets, thanks in part to gentrification. But Royce, her cousin, is a failing student who is involved with gangs, thanks in part to the neighborhood's legacy of crime and the surrounding poor neighborhoods. The second trend we're seeing is integration by immigration. And in this, we're seeing near-poor neighborhoods that were previously dominated by one ethnic group become integrated thanks to the arrival of new immigrant communities. The newcomers here are immigrants, not yuppies, because neighborhoods tend not to be as attractive to yuppies. They're further away from the city centers where the yuppies tend to work. And so instead you have ethnic enclaves that need space to grow, basically expanding and encroaching on these near-poor neighborhoods. and you have various groups taking out space in the neighborhood. So for at least temporarily, the neighborhood is diverse. This is a situation we see in Sunset Park, which used to be Irish, Polish, and Scandinavian at one point. They moved out to the suburbs, and they were replaced by Puerto Ricans. By the 1980s, they were the majority population there. Now they're being replaced by Mexicans, Chinese, Dominicans, Hasidic Jews, Pakistanis, and others. Sunset Park now has a striking multi-ethnic division of labor, with each group taking on a specific niche. The Mexicans working in factories, the Dominicans running the car services, the Chinese running the shops, and so on. So the chief problem in this neighborhood, in these kinds of neighborhoods, that is dealing with ethnic tensions. In Sunset Park, for example, you have a situation where many Puerto Ricans, the old-timers, express open disdain for the Mexicans. They think they're taking over their businesses. They complain about their lack of civic mindedness, and these are the same charges, of course, that were leveled against Puerto Rican newcomers when the neighborhood was largely white. Another problem faced by these neighborhoods is a lack of grocery stores and retail outlets. Box stores and major chains tend to avoid these neighborhoods because of the low volume of sales, the high security costs, and high rents compared to suburban areas. So New York poor families have to rely on convenience stores, in New York bodegas, for basic necessities. Getting fresh fruits and vegetables or having a healthy diet is very difficult in these kinds of neighborhoods. Another area that we studied in our book was the challenges that New York poor faced in building assets. New York poor families find it difficult to save and to buy their own homes. And meanwhile, they are vulnerable to becoming trapped in debt because of credit card overspending. Part of the problem is that many New York poor families do not have bank accounts. There are 28 million Americans who do not have bank accounts, and these are almost entirely poor and near poor households. More than 40 million Americans also have low credit scores or no credit score, and again, the near poor are disproportionately represented in their ranks. So why did the near poor stay away from banks? In part, this is because some of them don't trust banks. Immigrants may not be used to, may be used to informal ways of saving, such as rotating credit associations. In immigrant communities, this is where people join together to pool savings, and then they give us the amount to one person every week, and it really depends on trust between the group that is saving collectively. Banks also, on the other hand, banks themselves tend to discourage near poor customers. Major banks have closed their brick and mortar branches in near poor neighborhoods, and they're encouraging their customers instead to move online. And online banking, unfortunately, may not be well suited for near poor households. To give one example of the kind of mismatch we were talking about, in the near poor neighborhood of Washington Heights, there are 15 bank branches. In East Midtown, there are more than 300. And the number of branches in Washington Heights has grown smaller over the years as branches have pulled out. Major banks have pulled out. Banks are also charging their customers larger fees if they don't put in a minimum amount of money to their bank accounts. And that disadvantages near poor customers who may not be able to put $1,000 into a bank account or may have to take out their money on a regular basis. So without bank accounts, near poor families have to resort to less than optimal alternatives. They have to spend a few bucks every time they need to pay a bill, for instance, to buy a money order. To get the money out of their paychecks, they have to turn to check cashing outlets, which charge fees per check. In New York, the fees charged are about 1.5% of the face value of the check. That's actually the state limit on that kind of charge for check cashing outlets. But in 19 states in this country, they do not have such limits, so the near poor could be charged much more. The fees charged by check cashing outlets are might be higher than what it costs to have a bank account, but the near poor typically find these outlets more convenient, and they actually want the near poor as customers, unlike banks. Besides the higher fees from check cashing, the problem with not having bank accounts is that the near poor do not establish relationships with bank, and that becomes a problem when they seek out loans, because it's difficult to get a loan if you do not have a relationship with a bank or you do not have a high credit score. From the bank's perspective, it obviously doesn't make much sense to give loans to near poor customers who are looking for small amounts, because it's the same amount of paperwork, the same pay for staff to give bigger loans as it is for small loans, so the incentive is definitely to make bigger loans. But without the loans from banks, near poor have to turn to loan sharks or payday advances, payday loans that charge exorbitant rates of interest. The other difficulty that the near poor face in building assets is that it's difficult for them to buy their own homes. For most Americans, as Kathy mentioned, their key asset is their home. 44% of all U.S. wealth comes from housing equity. Owning a home provides financial stability by allowing families to borrow against the value of their homes when they need extra cash. Homeownership also provides a variety of benefits to the neighborhood one lives in, such as access to good schools for one's children. Homeowners tend to take better care of their property than renters, and homeownership is arguably the most important marker of middle-class status in this country. In spite of the importance of this, the near poor are at a serious disadvantage when it comes to their rates of homeownership compared to other Americans. 68% of Americans overall own a home, but looking at the lowest quintile, income quintile that is, of Americans, the poor, 46% own a home, and among the second quintile, which is the near poor, 58% do. So the rates are much lower. For many near poor, their modest income is what makes it difficult for them to get the necessary loans to buy a home. And the Gervais family in our book shows some of the challenges for near poor families to buy a home, especially a first home. Rita Gervais is a divorced mother with an adolescent daughter. She was once middle class, but she became near poor when she got divorced and lost the income of her husband. So she's struggling right now to save up and to get a home because she doesn't make enough money as the owner of a very small daycare business. So what happens eventually is that she has to turn to her ex-husband to be the co-signer of her mortgage, because otherwise she can't get a loan that way. Even when the near poor can get financing to buy a home, their ability to keep that home is uncertain. When rising interest rates prevent the near poor from making their mortgage payments, they can lose their home. And we should also remember, too, that the terrible state of the subprime mortgage market right now affects near poor disproportionately, because they often have to turn to subprime loans to finance home purchases. There are also problems with predatory lending and near poor families receiving subprime mortgages, however, when they should be eligible for better rates. The kind of predatory lending we're talking about includes so-called hit-and-run contractors who vastly overcharge for repairs and then put a lien on a person's home when the owners can't pay. And the Floyd family actually ran into this problem. They lost their one financial asset, their house, because of a hit-and-run contractor. Sandra Floyd's mother had struggled over decades to get this house, and it was a crucial part of the family's asset. But they lost it after they signed some paperwork for home repairs by a contractor, and they just didn't understand the paperwork, and they didn't know what their rights were. And that's a general problem among near poor, is a general lack of financial literacy, an understanding of how market works and how the market works and how credit works. And this also extends to credit cards. The near poor are at a risk of falling into serious debt because of lack of knowledge about how credit cards work and their difficulty in reining in their use of credit. The near poor, actually 6 out of 10 of near poor own credit cards, and that rate is actually twice the rate of poor households. And the rate has gone up faster among the near poor than among all other income groups over the past 3 decades. It's important to remember that credit cards were once only for the very wealthy in this country. That changed in the early 80s, and then by the early 90s we had credit card companies targeted even the the poor and the recently bankrupt were being targeted for credit cards. But we should say that credit card usage among the near poor differs from usage among the poor and more affluent families in some important ways. For instance, research on credit card usage finds that the unemployed use them sparingly for emergencies and necessities, but low-income workers use them regularly for discretionary expenses and more general spending. Lower-income households may be less likely to have cards than more affluent households, but those that do are more active users of cards and tend not to pay their balances in full every month. In other words, the near poor are cash cows for credit card companies. And for their part, the near poor don't need any coaxing to use credit cards. Some were previously poor and on welfare, and so they have deferred gratification for a very long time. And now that they have steady jobs, they feel that they deserve a little material comfort, and they start spending. And I'll just wrap up with one example of this. That's the Coronado family. And Julia Coronado was actually one of the most successful subjects in her book. She was a welfare recipient formerly and a low-wage worker. But then she went to community college, got an associate's degree, and got a white-collar job as a scheduling coordinator at a Manhattan medical clinic. But once she got her job, she started spending, going on a spending spree, and she acquired $9,000 worth of credit card debt. And partly this was because she just didn't understand how to use credit cards, and also was paying for some unnecessary things like, for instance, she was convinced by the credit card company to get a credit guard on her account, a totally optional service that she didn't really need. So these are some of the problems that near poor families face in their lack of financial literacy and the kind of risk that they have for going into debt. Thank you very much.
We're happy to take comments, questions, your thoughts on this subject.
I'll moderate that for
Please
just a second.
do.
Let me first of all thank you both for that presentation. I'll take prerogative for just two questions to start. I was interested. I know your research is not just looking at secondary research over in the near term. You've really gone back and over an extended period of time, even to 1995, looking at beginning to follow these families and looking at them. And part of that 1995 date sort of stands in my mind in terms of welfare reform in '96, and I'm interested in terms of your, as you've done the research and you think about ways in which we can improve the welfare system, as we think about particularly fathers, as we think about the other needs of families. I'm interested if you could dig a little deeper in terms of welfare reform and what you've noticed through this extended period where you began your research around the time things began to change in many states and then nationally, that we could draw for national policymakers. And secondly, I'd be interested on a personal level, given the depth that you went through and the time period, how this experience in writing this book changed the two of you. So.
Well, let me take a crack at those questions. It's true that I began this research as welfare reform was unfolding. Of course, it took quite a while before time-limited welfare became a reality in anybody's household. The passage of the bill in 1996 didn't really begin to hit households until the early part of the 2000s. And this did have an effect on some of the families in this book, but I don't want to exaggerate it. I don't think welfare reform by itself was really as critical as the improvements in the labor market, which were tremendously important. All of a sudden you had, labor shortages and mobility opportunities that were opening up to people that had previously been overlooked as private employers were hitting, in the state of Massachusetts, we had 2% unemployment. That changes the landscape dramatically and makes employers look for people like this where they might not have before. So I wouldn't want to completely overblow the impact of welfare reform. It was certainly there, and for families like some of the ones that we've talked about, it was the initial push into the labor market. But the dramatic improvements in the private labor market were at least as important in changing their fortunes. So does this give us any particular purchase on changing welfare policy? Well, I think the main policy instrument there was just to cut the value of the stipend in ways that made and increase the value of work through the earned income tax credit, which made the gap between work and not work quite pronounced, and that was not lost on these families. And in fact, I would say of all the policy instruments afoot, the earned income tax credit is probably the most important in putting more money in their pockets, and they do understand that quite well. It's a very important savings device for those families who are still eligible for it. If you get up to the top of the missing class, you probably aren't eligible anymore because you've exceeded those the income ceilings. But at the bottom end, you certainly are benefiting from the earned income tax credit. In terms of how it changed my perspective, and then I'll let Victor speak for himself. When you work with families over a long period of time, you learn things about them that would be impossible to know if you were just working as a snapshot. And many social scientists of necessity are working on a snapshot basis. It could be a very in-depth kind of snapshot, but nonetheless, seeing, for example, what happened to Omar, the young man who I first met when he was about 8 or 9 years old, who always was troubled in school, but whose mother was there to look after him, and watching him unfold over a 6-year period, the end of which we find him in a prison in upstate New York, and we've watched him run off the rails and watched what it meant to have parents who were not around to supervise him in a neighborhood in which you could get into trouble, watched his teachers and counselors try to rescue him for the school system or for his own benefit, and unable to do so, in part because in his neighborhood it's easy to be influenced by the wrong people, and if your parents are not there to keep you on the straight and narrow, it becomes much more difficult. If I had only studied his family for 18 months or so, when we first met, I would have one vision of what Omar's life was like. Following him over the 6 to 7 years, you get a very different story, and the impact of the cumulative changes becomes more apparent. I think one other point I'll make is that in the policy areas that I know many, I should stand up because there's some people I can't see, and they can't see me. In the policy areas that are that we dwell on in this book, the communities that brought them to being, the policy communities that brought them into being, were thinking usually about one constellation of issues. So the welfare reform folks were thinking about how to get people to exit off the welfare reform, welfare bills rolls. And the school reform community was thinking about how to get kids to learn their basics and not move on through social promotion. But really nobody was thinking about what it would mean to pull those two policies together behind the closed doors of a family. And it turns out that they're not particularly compatible policies. The policies that drive parents into the labor market, even those that are attracting them simply by higher wages, don't work very well alongside No Child Left Behind, in which the expectation is that families are going to pick up a huge part of the education burden. The schools, particularly these schools, cannot push these kids over those tests by themselves. They are expecting parents to take them to the library, to read to them at night, even parents who are not well educated themselves. You pull these two things together and they simply don't march together to the same drummer. And I think that by doing this kind of field work over a long period of time, these clashes emerge in ways that if you were just studying welfare reform or you were just studying education and doing so for a short period, you just wouldn't see it.
Sure. Yeah. I just want to add a point to Kathy's mention of the earned income tax credit. That is an important subsidy for low-income workers. But we should remember too that for childless workers, the benefit is very minuscule. It's $400 maximum, and it taps out at $12,000 annual household income. So it doesn't even reach many near poor households. And we're actually in a situation now because of the low amount of that credit that we're actually taxing people at the poverty line, near poor families just above the poverty line, into poverty because we're not fully covering their taxes through that credit. Regarding how this book has affected me, I would say it's definitely made me much more grateful for the own benefits of that I enjoy as someone living in middle class. Just to think of the lack of a financial safety net that these families have, just being one divorce, one layoff, one illness away from poverty. It's a pretty sobering thought. And these are the families that we think about as ideal of the American work ethic, hard-working Americans who are struggling to support their children. And it doesn't seem that we pay them much attention or doing much to help them and give them a helping hand that could make sure they don't fall into poverty when the economy slows down.
Okay. All right. Questions? Sure.
A lot of the trends that you're talking about, payday lending or credit cards, subprime mortgage, pretty much happened in the last 10 years or so. And as they were happening, many of us celebrated it as the democratization of credit. Good thing. From today's perspective, New America anyway, are rethinking this. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on how we might begin to re-regulate the financial services industry, to take a more paternalistic stance, and like that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I mean, one thing we don't want to do is shut off credit entirely, and I worry about the sort of backlash happening in a way that would make it impossible for these families to own homes, for example, or to seek repairs. And I do understand that the lending industry sort of almost has to have some flexible standards if they're going to take these. I mean, the alternative is to shut these families out completely, and that would not be very helpful. But the kind of predatory practices, the usurious interest rates that they face, I think are really ought to be out of bounds and ought to be regulated in ways that make it much more difficult for predatory lenders. There's a difference between garden variety subprime lending and predatory lending. Predatory lenders understand very well what they're trying to do. They are basically scheming to take these assets away and setting up lending structures that are almost by definition going to be impossible to meet. That's certainly what happened to the Floyd family. So I think that kind of lending we need to understand better. I think I led a class at Princeton this past term in which my students were trying to just understand who are the predatory lenders, for example, in Trenton, New Jersey. It's not that easy to figure out. Loans change hands so many times over that if you try and track who was the originator of the terms that led to a foreclosure, you have to dig back in a paperwork trail that's very deep indeed. And I had an army of students who could do that, but we tried to develop a kind of landscape of predatory lending just to understand who were the bad guys in Trenton. I think there could be better regulation that would identify the patterns of the truly predatory lenders and shine a light on them and make it more difficult for them to stay in business. At the same time, I think consumer education is really important. Not easy to achieve by any means, but very important. It was striking how poorly the families we studied understood what they were signing. No one, even I don't read the fine print of the credit cards that I get, but I have only one, and I pay it off every month. I have lousy credit from this point of view because I don't actually use credit at all. So credit card companies don't like people like me very much. But for the families who don't understand what it means to pay the minimum balance every month, don't understand how much it really costs to buy things this way, consumer education, I think, is really important, but a lot easier said than done. I mean, we're talking about families that are frantically busy all the time, and they're not likely to be easily reached. And I hate to say that a more paternalistic approach may be necessary, but it may be necessary because it certainly beats carrying $9,000 in debt when all you earn is $32,000 a year.
Great.
I was just curious, the story of who I think you said who actually went to community college interested me. It didn't sound like you saw that very often, and I was just wondering what you see in terms of the ability of them to get more education, more marketable skills, and sort of what allowed her to do it while others couldn't.
Actually, we see a lot more of this than you might imagine, and one of the things that distinguishes the missing class from others who are below the poverty line is that they often have more education. One thing we need to understand about people at the bottom of the income spectrum with respect to education is that they go on to get a lot of education, but it takes a long, long time. I mean, it can take 10 to 15 years to complete a college education, and I would not pretend that the people we were studying were getting close to that point. But in other studies I've done, that has clearly been the case. Why does it take so long? Well, one of the reasons it takes so long is that they're having to drop out to earn enough money to go back to school, and it's just a never-ending cycle of dropping in and dropping out. But they keep going with it at rates that are just astounding to me. I published a book last year called Chutes and Ladders, which looked at low-wage workers in Harlem over time, and I was astounded at how much further education they had received, both in terms of sort of applied education, in a sense, trade education, trade skills, and just garden variety higher education. But one thing we could surely do about that is to improve our financial aid policies to deal with the so-called non-traditional student, who's now 3/4 of the American student body in higher education. Only about a quarter of America's students are of the kind that, 18 to 22 on their parents' payroll, so to speak. The other 3/4 are this so-called non-traditional group, and we really have done relatively little to foster their increased human capital. But I have to say, most poor and near poor families know that higher education is important and seek it. Whether they're able to stick with it is another matter, but it's not for lack of knowing that it would make a difference. And in particular, in this book, we advocate that for near poor children, for the children in near poor households, it's extremely important to make sure they get their hands on the kind of financial aid which may even be available and they don't know about it. They don't go to the schools where they have counselors standing by to help them access it. And it's really quite critical to their futures and becoming increasingly difficult, not only to access, but the cost of higher education, public higher education, is growing. In fact, we may be looking at a situation in which the very term public higher education is becoming a misnomer, as many states, here in the New America Foundation, because you've studied this issue, many states have been clawing back state contributions to higher education, causing tuition to rise, causing it to be far less accessible. The City University of New York, which has been the gateway for poor, near poor, immigrant, and first-generation college goers for decades, every time they raise tuition by $1,000, 40,000 people drop out of the City University of New York. And that's a real loss of human capital, and that's a loss of future earnings. That's a loss of more educated taxpayers who would otherwise take their place in the white-collar sector. So it's very much penny wise and pound foolish to do this, and increasingly this is what we're seeing across the country.
Gentleman right there.
Could you say something about the racial composition of this new class compared with the poor and the overall racial composition?
You will not be surprised to learn, I actually just ran these numbers, we didn't have this in the book, but I ran these numbers the other day, and you won't be surprised to learn that minorities are disproportionately represented. However, the whites are the majority. About 66% of the missing class are white. And as I recall, about 14% are black, so it's slightly overrepresenting African Americans. And about 20% were Hispanic, as I recall. But it's a majority white population. The people in this book, however, are the inner city version of the missing class. And I should point out that we represent in this book really one group, and in some ways the more optimistic, that is the upwardly mobile inner city minority families. There is another very large group of people in the missing class, about whom I've written in earlier books, the downwardly mobile out of the middle class, who've fallen into the missing class by virtue of job loss, job instability, factories closing, and so on. I've written about them in a book a long time ago called Falling from Grace. And it's been interesting to me as I've gone around the country, and Victor's had the same experience, of doing NPR programs all over, New Hampshire, Wisconsin. I guess because of who listens to NPR, the people who have been calling in have been almost entirely that second group. Displaced white workers left over from heavy industry who have fallen down into the missing class rather than ascended into it as the people we have.
And all your families were New Yorkers?
Yes.
Does that in any way distort the picture?
I think it only distorts the picture in the sense that it's not about that downwardly mobile group that fell into the missing class. It doesn't distort their lives or the particular group they represent, which is ascendance into the missing class.
Chairman, I have a number of questions for you. It's a very compelling presentation, but I wanted to just jump in here because it's on kind of these thresholds. And you're obviously, when you ran the numbers, you're using specific data points that are kind of linked to our official poverty line threshold. And I just wanted to ask you, kind of press you a little bit on that, and how useful you think that is as a way to kind of cut and define the group that you're identifying. I mean, a lot of times it sounds like they're sharing a lot of the same problems and concerns that the actual poor would have. And I think if we look at the definition of poor and the official poverty line, it doesn't have a lot of utility for analysts going forward looking at these issues.
These are, I'm going to let Victor weigh in on this one as well. These are very contentious issues, as you know, and there are lots of reasons to raise questions about the poverty line itself, with which we begin. I think the reason why we tend to stick with it is that it can allow us to benchmark change over time, but it comes with a whole bunch of problems. As you know, it's not regionally based. The market basket in different cities is hugely different. It doesn't take into account transfers. I mean, there are 1,000 reasons why the poverty line itself is problematic. So if you double it, which is what we've done, you end up with some of the same problems. Nonetheless, because we do use that poverty line number in the country as a whole to benchmark whether we'd be doing better or worse as a nation, looking at the people who are up above that line, up to double that line, I do think has a certain utility for drawing attention to this group of people. Whether it is phenomenologically real is another matter. Of course, when you, as is true with any spectrum, if you look at the people at the very bottom of the missing class, they don't look very, very different from those who are at the top of the poverty line. And if you look at those who are at the very top of the missing class, they're edging more toward middle class-like lives. That's going to be the problem with any sort of spectrum. Do you want to add to that?
And another consideration, too, is that the people that we interview themselves do not consider themselves poor many times, and that they distinguish themselves quite sharply, in fact, from the welfare poor, for instance. Some of them were previously on welfare, and they see themselves in a different stage of their lives, and clearly separate in terms of, justified or not in terms of values or in terms of outlook than the poor. And so from that perspective, too, they are different class. And I would also say the advantage of focusing on New York, perhaps, too, is that the cost of living is obviously higher in New York than other parts of the country, and so that also plays into how we judge the near poor and the poor, and that is a consideration too, that any kind of federal poverty line does not tap into.
Okay. I know we have a bunch of other questions here. The lady there.
I was curious what you saw as the possibilities for increasing the political clout of this group, and whether, like the possibility of alliances with the poor, which might not benefit anyone, or alliances with the middle class who might not, want that, or, individual voting, or kind of what, because you identified, I think, the interesting problem that this is a group that's neither the target of public policies or social policies, nor a group that politicians pay attention to. So how could that change?
Well, that, I think, is a $64,000 question for which I don't have the answer. When you pick up a copy of the book, you'll notice that the foreword was written by John Edwards, and that's not an accident, because I think of all of the people who are running for office today, he is the one who has placed the greatest amount of effort and attention and policy thinking on what should happen to people like this. But it's difficult to win an election, as you've noticed, I'm sure, by focusing on this group. These people tend not to vote very much. They're not a whole lot better, I don't think, than the real poor, who are very poorly represented indeed. And all I can say is I favor the good old-fashioned voter registration drives that were, I think, quite effective during the Civil Rights era. If people are registered and they vote, politicians have to pay attention to them. But that we're a long way from there, and I wish I had an answer to your question. I don't.
Mark?
Thanks for this terrific presentation. What struck me about it was that there's been a tremendous consensus over the last couple decades in social policy that concentrated poverty is kind of a thing in itself, and the experience, that's different and exacerbates the problems of pure economic poverty. So that not having people in your community who a kid not seeing people working, for example, tends to perpetuate that cycle. And we've had some systematic experiments with economic integration, like the Moving to Opportunity Act, and that's sort of inherent, that assumption that integrating that economic integration is a way of breaking the cycle of poverty. It's built into Edwards' approach to poverty. It's built into the Center for American Progress plan on poverty, for example. It seems to me that what you're talking about here is a number of kind of natural experiments in economic integration, and it sounds like you see some pretty significant either downsides or non-advantages to the kind of integration that you're getting in neighborhoods like Sunset Park. And I wonder if you can comment on that.
I think it's actually a very mixed bag, meaning there's some very positive aspects. These people don't live in concentrated poverty neighborhoods for the most part, and that's partly because of the gentrification trend that Victor was pointing out. And when the mixture occurs, the schools do get better. Not great, but better. But they can't pull completely away from concentrated poverty neighborhoods because they tend to abut them. That is, they tend to be sandwiched in between these two trends. And I do think, I mean, there's no question that if you can remain stable in such a neighborhood, that is, if you still have housing you can hold on to, you are much better off than if you're living in a concentrated poverty neighborhood. There's no question about that. But that doesn't mean that you will necessarily feel like you're as at home as you once were. Now, if you ask even the Floyd family whether you would choose to live in a poor and dangerous neighborhood over living in a more affluent neighborhood in which you didn't feel completely comfortable, they wouldn't take more than a nanosecond to say the latter. Right? There's no question. They would rather live in a safer neighborhood where you can walk from the subway to your home without worrying about getting mugged, even if it means your teenagers may be harassed by the police, which they don't like very much. But relative to being knocked over and burgled, or there's no question that the neighborhoods are advantageous. That said, some of the public services in these neighborhoods are really struggling to keep up with the burdens placed on them. The soup kitchens are full. The churches are strained. The hospitals are overburdened because they're not out of the woods. Just because they're gentrifying, they're not out of the woods. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I would also add that the gentrification aspect of it may not be so bad if you could find some way to help near poor families deal with the rising rents and the rising cost of living in those communities. Because the gentrification does, as we mentioned, bring all these other collateral benefits in terms of improved infrastructure and better schools and the like. So that is a positive thing. But how to pay for it and how to make sure that these families aren't pushed out of the neighborhood is also a key question.
And they are pushed out.
More questions. Go ahead, Adam.
At the beginning, you had cited a figure that this missing class represented roughly 1 in 6 Americans, about 50 million people. And you said you had run the numbers. I'm just trying to figure out who you're counting. I presume you're not counting the elderly.
No, we counted everybody.
Well,
It's just adjusted for family size.
It's just because you have. I think it's a very diverse group.
It is.
But it does sound like you're drilling down. Because in some sense, you wouldn't count many elderly households. You wouldn't count any recent graduates and college students.
If you just take a strict income definition, which is what we do, you count all of those people. But you do have to drill down to understand which of them you should be worried about.
Yeah, certainly for policy. So I'm just trying to get a sense of how big a group is this, like the group that's basically mired in this situation for a good portion of their adult lives. The ones who can't get out are the ones who fall in and can't get back out again. How big a group is this?
You would have to subtract out, well, I don't know. Some people would subtract out the groups you're talking about, the elderly, for example. I think that it's debatable whether or not we ought to, because we could subtract out a lot of people from the poverty figures, too, if we started disaggregating in this way. And maybe we should disaggregate all the way around, and then we wouldn't talk about 37 million poor households either, because that would, we might reduce that number if you wanted to start that sort of disaggregation. But we didn't do a breakdown that separates out the elderly or new young students or something like that. We just strictly multiplied times the poverty level and looked at the difference between, looked at the difference.
I'm just saying for policy considerations,
yes,
it is very important.
It is important, I agree.
Yeah. Do you have a question?
Yes. Would you say something about the factor of getting and staying married and the timing of the first child, like preparation preceding that?
Well, obviously, having 2 incomes in a household is hugely important to almost everyone except those who are really quite well off. And so if you lose one income through divorce, and that was true in many of the single-parent households we were looking at, that is, they were not never married, they were divorced, and that plummeted many of the women who might have been previously better off into the missing class and basically lost a second income. Now, there are many ways in which that second income could be replaced. One is their children end up in the labor force too, and you multiply the number of workers under the household roof by pressing your children into the labor market. Not an uncommon strategy at all. So divorce is a very serious problem. Marital instability certainly doesn't help matters. We don't see so many out-of-wedlock children in these households, though there are some. What we do see is single parents who are sort of receiving receiving the problem cases in their extended families. Okay, so we have examples in our book of people who are taking care of nieces and nephews because their sisters were very troubled and couldn't take care of their children, so they accept the burden. The Floyd family, which has 9 members, is made up of the 2 elders who are the grandparents of this large number of grandchildren, because the middle generation was really victimized by the downturn in these neighborhoods and turned into serious drug addiction and exited the scene altogether. Those people definitely had out-of-wedlock children who are now the responsibility of the Floyd grandparents. So family instability certainly has an impact on pushing people into the missing class, and it creates burdens for them in taking care of the members of their extended family networks. That was one of your, what was the other group you were?
Well,
was that the main thing
I
you
guess
wanted?
it's a matter of like, what do you do first? Do you buy? I mean, a typical solid middle class strategy is to even buy a house before the first child comes along. But I think that's probably not done.
I think that's becoming very, very difficult without 2 incomes. 2 solid incomes and a fair amount of education these days. But these families are not, I don't think they're the people you would point to as somehow unmindful of the need to have a certain kind of resource base before they have children. It's just that resource base comes under very heavy weather if there's divorce or job loss, or they're right on the edge of what can be afforded, and the edge withers because a kid gets sick and then somebody's kicked out of the labor force because they've got a kid with asthma to take care of. That happens all the time. I mean, in these families where you've got kids who've got lead poisoning and ADHD, they're very high maintenance kids because the health issues are so serious, and that can derail the parents out of the labor market and cut that down to a single earner.
Okay, a few more questions here. Sir.
You talked about the issue of higher education and becoming inaccessible. I'm involved with a job readiness life skills program, and many of the students who come to us are reading at 4th, 5th grade level. And the tragedy is the school system didn't do a very good job in preparing them. And now it just seems like they have no obligation. And so it seems like if we can cough up, I forget what the numbers are, with $25,000 or $40,000 a year to incarcerate people, don't we have some obligation also to try and work on the prevention side as a policy?
I couldn't agree with you more, and actually a goodly part of our book at the end talks about early childhood education is absolutely crucial, because under a No Child Left Behind regime, the inequalities between families in what families can provide in the way of educational support is hugely consequential. And families like the ones we're looking at, which have kids in so-called family daycare with drug addicts wandering in and out, those kids are not going to start school reading ready, and they are going to be the ones who can't read that you see, many years later on. It would be a very wise investment indeed to pour money into early childhood education. The latest research by Jim Heckman and others shows very clearly you get the biggest bang for your buck if you put it in early, because remedial education is very expensive, not very effective, whereas early childhood education pays off across the lifespan. And this is one of the reasons why countries like Italy, France, I mean, almost all of our competitor nations have been investing very heavily exactly in this strategy, and it pays off. And we would do well to make it pay off for us as well, because at the end of the day, when you see these people, we're talking about the loss of skill that is almost impossible to recoup.
A few more questions. Lady.
You mentioned at the beginning that we're a homeownership society, and we've certainly grown in homeownership substantially over the last 50 years. But there's a lot of downsides to homeownership, and certainly we've been seeing some of those downsides lately with the mortgage crisis, and also the decline in affordable rental housing across the board. And in other countries, in other industrialized countries, most people rent and they have very stable societies. And I'm wondering if you've thought about policies that would encourage stable rental housing as opposed to encouraging homeownership, which puts the individual highly at risk, as I well know.
I understand your point. I think it's a difficult one to push in the American context, because if we look at the Nordic countries, for example, where you have this huge rental sector, and it's mainly a state-owned rental sector, you've got all kinds of other policies that go along with that, which mean that you don't need the private asset in order to fund your own retirement, for example. I mean, if you are in a Nordic country, your education is free, your health care is free, or it's free in the sense you've paid for it through the tax system, and so you don't need that private asset. I mean, it would take a total revolution in social policy, I think, in the U.S. for home ownership not to be as critical a resource as it is. I agree with you that it is risky for some kinds of families, but when 68% of the country owns homes and is mainly banking their savings, that's where their savings have derived from, to cut out a whole huge swathe of the population and more or less say you can't participate in this by virtue of their low income, is to cut them off from the only really effective private safety net most of us have. So I take your point entirely, and stable rental housing would certainly be a boon. I mean, one of the reasons why the families we've studied are still in these gentrifying neighborhoods is that they're in rent-regulated housing and they're in public housing, and that means they can stay, whereas everybody else has more or less disappeared and decamped to inner-ring suburbs that are becoming increasingly poor in the U.S. But short of a total revolution in our benefit programs, I don't see how we will manage with just rental.
Okay. I thought I saw 3 hands here.
Way in the back?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was interested in your use of the term missing class. And the reason is that on the one hand, there's much to look at and say, look at all the help we don't give this group, of which I'm a complete ascriber to that view. On the other hand, if you think about over the last 15 years where both federal and state governments have been willing to increase investment for low-income families, it's been precisely this group. So expand EITC, do CHIP, which doesn't go at all to people below the poverty line. It's all kids really exactly in this range. Even though the child care investments have been extremely paltry, they've really been about this group. And the partially refundable child tax credit was all about this group. In fact, the political establishment was only willing to take refundability to the point where they would be this group as opposed to the poor group, roughly speaking. So on the one hand, your stories and countless research reports make very clear the enormous gaps and enormous pressure those families are under. But in the world of the limited amount of dollars that politicians have been willing to put into low-income families as opposed to other priorities, this group has seen investments grow quite substantially, whereas growth in programs for people below the poverty line are almost non-existent over the last 15 years, and that's structural.
I think I would disagree with your characterization. I think that the investments have been most heavy in working poor families, and these families are not poor at all. The working poor have been the prime beneficiaries of increases in the EITC. This group tends to exit out about in the middle of the pack.
Well, the EITC phases out at about $41,000. It phases out for families with 2 or more kids, right? It's certainly true for childless workers, but for families with 2 or more kids, the lion's share of the dollars comes in the phased-out range, which is between 100 and 200% of the poverty line.
So, as you say, there are important things that have been done for this group, and we need to do all the more. I don't think they're recognized as a group in this way. What they are is distinguished from the poor, and I think that is reflective of a certain kind of middle ground social policy, which I actually favor, not to the exclusion of the poor, but I think that investment in this group has certain payoffs that are critical for proving to those below the poverty line that there's something to look forward to up above it. There's a reason to struggle up that far so that you can benefit from these. But I think the big hammering has been in the difference between those below the poverty line and those above it, where the EITC has benefited, though, especially as you say, those above it, and those below have been hammered on all kinds of counts, increasing that gap, which was the whole point, actually, I thought, of the Clinton administration.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, before she asks, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask,
how does your study translate to rural areas of this country, if at all?
It's been interesting, again, hearing from people around the country who've been calling in from rural areas into the Wisconsin Public Radio, New Hampshire Public Radio, because those calls have all been coming from basically the displaced white working class, the group we're not talking about in this book, who fell into this class. And they seem to be feeling particularly strapped around health care. So if S-chip passes and isn't vetoed, it will make a very big difference for those households, because the health care catastrophes they face are particularly serious, and they feel utterly abandoned on that score. But I think most dramatic to me has just been the sense from the heartland of the country that they've been abandoned and nobody cares about what's happened to them at all, in part because they hear a lot about what we do for the poor, and have come to believe, contrary to what we were just hearing, that no one really cares or even notices that they exist.
Okay. Let's have one final question, sir.
This is kind of related to the question of how do you define these classes, and I'm wondering whether through this process how you conceive of middle class, I guess, because there's a lot of attention about the middle class these days, and are we, I mean, the 40 to 60% quintile, I mean, is that the right, even though it is technically the right sort of category, does that make sense?
The middle class is a many-splendored thing, as you point out, and it's not a technical term at all, so it can be defined in a variety of different ways. And one way to do it is those middle income bands. Another way is to look at home ownership, or basically a consumption-based definition. Lots of writers use occupational definitions. All of these make some sense because they kind of migrate around an ideal type we have in mind when we speak about the middle class. But one of the advantages of using these factors of the poverty line is we don't get mired in this particular question. But I do recognize that it's a term we throw around, and for good reason. I think we're generally thinking, when we think about the middle class, of middle to upper middle income earners who are homeowners, who live principally in suburban communities, and who have white-collar occupations. That's generally what we think of, although one could argue around the edges about the boundaries of that group.
I wanted to stop the formal questions there. Kathy and Victor were so kind to squeeze us in between their Diana Rehm interview this morning and a television interview, I think, in a little bit this afternoon. So we're very appreciative. We can maybe have an informal dialogue here as their schedule allows for a few minutes, so I appreciate that. I appreciate you all coming, and very much appreciate both Kathy and Victor. Thanks for